GOG Galaxy is finally being discussed as a native Linux project. Not released, not in beta, not something you can install this afternoon. But GOG has confirmed that it has a specialist on board and is actively exploring how to bring Galaxy to Linux. That matters because GOG occupies a very particular place in PC gaming. It sells games without mandatory DRM, it gives people a meaningful way to preserve installers, and it has a catalog that a lot of Linux users already own. Yet the official GOG experience on Linux has always had a rather awkward hole in the middle. You can buy games, you can download Linux native builds when they exist, but the Galaxy launcher, the part that handles a modern library, updates, social features, and parts of the account experience, has never been a native Linux app. So this video is not a victory lap. It is a reality check. What has GOG actually said? What has it very deliberately not promised? Will this mean Windows games suddenly work on Linux? And if you own a Steam Deck or a Linux desktop, should you wait or should you keep using the tools that already work today? The detail that decides whether this becomes useful or merely symbolic is not the logo. It is compatibility. A native launcher is great, but a launcher on its own does not make a Windows-only game run on Linux. Valve solved that problem with Proton. Whether GOG builds, adopts, or simply sidesteps a similar solution is still completely open. There is another unanswered question as well. If a native client eventually arrives, does that change the day-to-day experience on handhelds like the Steam Deck? Or do third-party launchers remain the sensible option? Keep that in mind, because the answer depends on what Galaxy actually does today, not what we wish it did. Before we get into the speculation, we need to separate three things that often get thrown into the same bucket: buying a game from GOG, running a game on Linux, and using GOG Galaxy. They overlap, but they are not the same job. When people say that GOG doesn't support Linux, they are usually describing one specific gap, but the wider situation is more nuanced. First, there is the storefront. GOG sells games through its website, and some games have native Linux builds that you can download directly. That part exists today. Second, there is game compatibility. A game made for Linux can run natively. A Windows-only game needs a compatibility path, usually Wine or Proton, before it can run on a Linux desktop or a Steam Deck. That path is about the game itself and the operating system underneath it. Third, there is the launcher. Galaxy is GOG's official client. On Windows and macOS, it can manage libraries, downloads, updates, cloud-related features where supported, achievements where supported, and social functions. On Linux, that official client is the missing piece. That distinction matters because the announcement is about the third problem, a native Galaxy client. It is not a statement that every GOG game is becoming Linux native. It is not a statement that GOG is shipping Proton, and it is not a release date. This is where headlines can create the wrong expectation. GOG is coming to Linux sounds as if a launcher has been released and a switch has been flipped. The more accurate version is slower but more useful. GOG has invested in a Linux specialist and has said it is actively exploring the best route to support Galaxy on Linux. That is genuine movement. It is also still early work. Why spend time on such careful wording? Because the difference determines whether a viewer should change their setup. If you own a Linux native game on GOG, you may already have a usable route. If you own a Windows-only GOG game, the key question is still whether it works under a compatibility layer. And if what you want is one official place to manage your library, then Galaxy itself is the relevant missing client. That leads to the practical question. If Galaxy has been missing for years, how have Linux gamers been using their GOG libraries in the meantime? The answer is more mature than many people realize, and it puts pressure on GOG to make the official client genuinely useful rather than simply late. For most Linux gamers, GOG has not been inaccessible. It has been fragmented. Native Linux builds can be downloaded from the web store when publishers provide them. For everything else, players have built workflows around tools such as Heroic Games Launcher, Lutris, Bottles, Plain Wine, and Proton-based setups. Heroic is particularly relevant here because it has become a familiar bridge for people with both GOG and Epic libraries. It can sign into supported accounts, manage installations, and help users select Wine or Proton versions. It is not official GOG software, and it does not magically solve every game. But it turns an awkward collection of installers into something much closer to a modern library. That availability changes the story. Linux users are not waiting in an empty room for the first way to play GOG games. The community has already supplied working paths. What is missing is official parity. A client GOG itself maintains, tests, and designs around Linux users. There are real advantages to that. An official client could make library management less intimidating for newcomers. It could give GOG a direct place to support Linux-specific issues. It could make it easier for the company to decide how Linux builds, updates, cloud functions, and account features should fit together. But none of those outcomes are automatic merely because a team is exploring the project. There is a trade-off with community tools too. They move quickly, but support can vary by game, launcher version, wine build, GPU driver, and distribution. One person's easy install is another person's evening of troubleshooting. That does not make them bad tools. It is exactly why an official Linux strategy could be valuable. But to understand how valuable, we need to look at the one word that keeps coming up whenever people compare GOG with Steam: Proton. This is the point where the announcement becomes much more than a client porting project. Steam did not become the default answer for Linux gaming just because it has a desktop client. Steam had a client long before Linux gaming reached its current level. The decisive change was Proton, Valve's compatibility layer, built on Wine and other components that lets a large number of Windows games run on Linux with a much more integrated experience. Proton is not magic. Compatibility varies, anti-cheat, launchers, video codecs, unusual middleware, and game-specific bugs can still be a problem. But it changed the expectation. Many players now install a Windows game on Steam, press play, and only learn about Proton if something goes wrong. GOG's statement does not say that it is building a Proton equivalent. It does not say it will bundle Wine. It does not say Galaxy will launch every Windows-only game on Linux. In fact, GOG deliberately said it was not ready to share a specific plan, timeline, or result. That restraint is important. There are several routes GOG could explore. It could focus first on native Linux games and library management. It could work with existing compatibility technologies. It could provide guidance without deeply integrating a compatibility layer. Or it could build something more ambitious. Today, we do not know which path it will take. This is also why viewers should be wary of treating the news as a reason to postpone a purchase or a setup. The evidence supports excitement, not certainty. If a game works through Heroic and Proton today, that is a real option. If it does not, the Galaxy announcement does not change that fact yet. Still, there is a reason this is worth watching closely. GOG's entire brand is built around ownership, offline installers, and less dependence on a single lockdown platform.
That could make GOG's ownership-first approach more useful on Steam Deck, living room PCs, and Linux desktops. And that makes the handheld question practical.
The Steam Deck has done something very important for Linux gaming. It has made the operating system visible to people who did not set out to become Linux users. They bought a handheld, they expected their library to work, and they learned just enough about compatibility layers, launch options, and alternative launchers to get the games they wanted running. For GOG owners, the current process is possible, but not always seamless. A player may install Heroic in desktop mode, sign into their GOG account, choose a Wine or Proton version, install a game, and then add it to Steam for a console-like launcher experience. That can work very well. It can also feel like a collection of sensible tools rather than one supported path. A native Galaxy client could reduce some of that friction. It might centralize library management. It might make updates, sign-in, and offline installers clearer. It might give GOG a more direct route to support the Linux community. But here is the careful part. A native client alone does not guarantee that Windows-only games work on Steam Deck. That still depends on the compatibility layer and on the game itself. By the way, I just checked the channel analytics for the last 28 days, and it turns out about 84% of you watching this channel are not subscribed yet. If these Linux deep dives help you make better decisions about hardware, gaming, or your next distro, hitting subscribe is the best free way to support the channel. And make sure you do not miss the next one. The bigger question is whether official support would change behavior for developers and publishers, not only for players. If the Linux audience becomes easier to reach and support through GOG's own systems, that could make native builds more attractive. But again, this is a possibility, not a promise. To see why that distinction matters, we need to look beyond the launcher and talk about what GOG represents in a market increasingly shaped by subscriptions and closed ecosystems. GOG is not simply another game launcher. Its appeal rests on a different relationship with ownership. With many GOG purchases, you can download installers and keep them. You are not entirely dependent on a subscription remaining active or a launcher deciding that you need to re-authenticate before a single-player game starts. That distinction becomes more meaningful on Linux. People who choose Linux often care about control. Control over their operating system, their files, their privacy, their hardware, and the software that makes their devices useful. A DRM-free game library fits neatly into that mindset. There are practical benefits too. Offline installers can be useful when a game is delisted, when a launcher changes direction, or when an internet connection is unreliable. They are not a guarantee against every preservation problem. Games can still rely on servers, third-party accounts, or online features, but they give the customer a more durable starting point. That is why Galaxy on Linux is more interesting than a simple convenience feature. The official client could connect a DRM-free catalog to a Linux audience that already values local control. It could also bring a more polished experience to people who currently choose Steam because it is simply easier on their device. The tension is that polish can come with complexity. A modern launcher is not merely a download button. It touches authentication, update systems, cloud synchronization, social features, telemetry choices, and compatibility expectations. Building that for Linux means dealing with a fragmented ecosystem of distributions, display servers, audio systems, GPU drivers, and packaging formats. That complexity explains why GOG's statement is cautious. A quick port that fails to handle real Linux workflows would not help the brand. A client that arrives later but understands how people actually use Linux could be more valuable. So the sensible question for viewers is not when can I install it, it is what should I watch for to know whether the final product is worth switching to. A useful Galaxy client on Linux does not have to copy every single feature from Steam on day one. But it needs to solve real problems, not merely provide a new window for a store. First, it needs reliable library management. Users should be able to see what they own, download native builds, keep their installers organized, and understand which game versions they have. That sounds simple, but it matters more on Linux because people often maintain multiple drives, multiple devices, or dual boot systems. Second, it needs a clear compatibility story. The client does not have to promise that every Windows game works. In fact, pretending that would be a mistake. But it should make the status understandable. Is the game native? Is it being launched through a chosen compatibility tool? Is there a known issue? Can the user select a version when troubleshooting? Third, it needs to respect Linux conventions. That means sensible installation locations, predictable permissions, support for common desktop environments, a clear update mechanism, and an approach to sandboxing or packaging that does not leave users guessing how the client interacts with their files. Fourth, handheld use matters. The Steam Deck has demonstrated that the Linux gaming audience is no longer only a desktop niche. A GOG client that works cleanly with controller navigation, larger text, and alternative launchers would have a much more compelling story than one that assumes a keyboard and mouse desktop only. Finally, GOG would need to communicate honestly. Early Linux users are often willing to test, report bugs, and work around missing features. What they do not appreciate is vague marketing that blurs "we are exploring support" into "we support everything." GOG's current wording is actually a good start, because it is specific about the work being early. That gives us a checklist. When GOG shares more, look for a native build, a supported distribution or packaging method, a detailed compatibility position, a Steam Deck story, and a release plan. Until then, the most useful thing we can do is separate confirmed facts from a very understandable amount of community hope. Until GOG provides more detail, the sensible approach is to use the tools that match the game you own rather than waiting for a future client. Start with the simplest case. If the game has a native Linux build on GOG, download and run that version. You avoid a compatibility layer entirely, and you are using the publisher's intended Linux release. If the game is Windows only, community launchers can make the process much more manageable. Heroic is a common starting point for people with GOG libraries because it provides a graphical way to sign in, install games, and choose a Wine or Proton style compatibility tool. For more specialized needs, Lutris or Bottles can offer a different level of control. Before installing a large game, check a current compatibility resource and community reports. Look for the exact title, your GPU type, the launcher requirements, and notes about anti-cheat or multiplayer. A game that runs perfectly in single player may still have an online mode that does not work. That is not necessarily a Linux problem GOG can fix alone. It may depend on the developer, the anti-cheat provider, or the game's server design. Use backups where appropriate. One advantage of DRM-free installers is that you can keep a copy of a working version. That does not mean you should ignore updates, but it gives you more control if an update introduces a regression or if you are setting up a device that will spend time offline. The goal is not to turn every Linux gamer into a wine expert. The goal is to make an informed choice. If a game works well now, enjoy it now. If it needs a few steps, use a launcher that explains those steps. And if you prefer to wait for a more official experience, that is a reasonable choice too. Just do not treat the current announcement as if the finished product is already here. That grounded approach also helps us answer the question that tends to appear in every comment section. Should you stop buying from Steam and move your whole library to GOG? The honest answer is more useful than a slogan. For most people, this is not an either-or decision. Steam and GOG solve different problems well. Steam has the stronger integrated Linux and Steam Deck story today, particularly because of Proton, controller support, workshop integration, and the way it manages a huge catalog through one familiar client. GOG offers a different strength: DRM-free purchases and offline installers. That can be appealing if you want a local archive of games you own, if you value a less restrictive model, or if a particular title is priced or presented better there. But on Linux, it asks you to be a little more hands-on today. The right choice depends on your priorities. If you want the lowest friction route for a Windows-heavy gaming library, Steam is often the simpler place to start. If you care deeply about DRM-free ownership, or you already own a significant GOG library, then community tools make GOG viable now, and future Galaxy support could make that experience much easier. There is also no rule saying you must commit to one store. You can buy a game where the licensing, price, support, and Linux experience make sense for you. The important thing is to distinguish your principles from a promise that has not been made yet. GOG's Linux work is encouraging, but it is not a reason to assume parity with Steam next month. The most practical takeaway is simple: keep using what works. Watch GOG's announcements for actual technical details. And when the client appears, evaluate it on its own merits: packaging, reliability, controller support, game compatibility, offline behavior, and whether it helps you manage the library you already own. With that in mind, we can now put the announcement in its proper place. It is not the end of the Linux gaming story. It is a signal that one of the largest DRM-free stores has decided Linux is worth serious exploration. That is meaningful, but only the implementation will tell us how meaningful. Here is the bottom line. GOG has confirmed that it is actively exploring native Linux support for GOG Galaxy and has a dedicated specialist working on the effort. That is real news. It is not a release, it is not a beta program, and it is not a promise that every Windows game will work through Proton. For Linux gamers, the correct response is cautious optimism. If you own GOG games, you have workable choices today. Native Linux builds where available, community launchers for other titles, and compatibility tools where they make sense. The official Galaxy project could eventually make that experience clearer and more supported. But its value will depend on the details GOG has not yet announced. The next signal to watch is not a teaser image, it is technical information. Does GOG announce a public build? Which Linux distributions or packaging methods will it support? Will it address Steam Deck use? Does it provide an official compatibility path for Windows games, or simply focus on native titles and library management? Those answers determine whether Galaxy becomes a genuinely useful Linux platform or just another launcher. If you found this GOG Galaxy breakdown interesting, you need to see why Linux gaming is about to explode in 2026. The link is on screen right now. It puts this announcement in the wider context of what is changing for Linux gamers. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a sudo user or get root access. Like the video if this cleared up the difference between a launcher, a compatibility layer, and a real Linux gaming platform. Subscribe for the next evidence-led Linux deep dive and sign up at tondoslinux.com/subscribe if you want the updates in your inbox as well.